There we go. Right.
Yeah.
Hi, Ellie. Thank you ever so much for joining us this morning. I'm going to hand over to you and let you introduce yourself and take it from there.
Perfect. So my name's Ellie Fisher. Sorry, I'm a bit dark. I've shut the blinds so that the dogs don't bark at people walking past. And I have a bit of a cold, so I'm sorry if I have to mute myself and cough or anything. But I'm an educational psychologist. I am a recently qualified educational psychologist. So actually have done quite a lot of training recently about what an EP is. So it was me who kind of volunteered to put the presentation together about the role of the EP and kind of what you can expect from the EP service. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. Make it bigger. So when we're thinking about kind of what the role of the EP is and what an educational psychologist is, the key bits of information that I thought I'd start off with is that we work with children and young people from the ages of 0 to 25. So we cover that kind of big age range that is also covered by an education, health and care plan. A lot of our work is about applying psychological theory. So that's what kind of makes us slightly different, is that we've had that training in psychology and we're kind of putting that together with our experience of education. So it used to be a requirement that everyone who was an educational psychologist had been a teacher beforehand. That's not the case anymore, but everyone has to have had quite a few years of experience working in a school in some capacity. So whether that's as a teaching assistant or whether that's or whether they're working maybe for like a children's charity or in care kind of roles, those types of things, everyone has to have had some kind of connection to education. I was a teacher before I was an educational psychologist. I worked in a secondary special school, but that's not the case for everybody who's an educational psychologist, unless they're someone who did the training quite a while ago. So a lot of our training is about kind of problem solving techniques. And what that means is that we train to kind of look at the big picture around a child, think about all of the factors that might be influencing how they present and how they behave, and then thinking about kind of ways we can support them, ways we can target some things that we might want to set for them, and kind of how that might then impact their kind of wider presentation if they were to work on that specific target area. We use kind of a few different assessment tools for that, and that sounds kind of scarier than it is. So some of it is just observation, seeing what they're like in school or in preschool. Some of it is working with the child, doing more formal assessments if that's needed, but often it's kind of more relaxed type kind of games and activities that allow us to kind of see how their strengths and areas of need. Then the final kind of bit of the role is monitoring and evaluating the interventions that are put in. So when an educational psychologist becomes involved, we always want to do a review later on in the year or after a period of time has passed, so that we can see how the kind of things that we've suggested are working or not working. And all of us are usually, I think, really open to feedback. We're always fine if it hasn't worked, and to then change what it is that we're suggesting and thinking might be a good idea for a young person. So the kind of main principles that we try to keep to in our work are holistic working. So quite often there's that question around what makes an educational psychologist different to maybe like a speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist or all of the other roles that you might encounter. And the kind of key difference that I see is that we try to look at how everything fits together. So there may be professionals who are more specialized in one of those areas, but we kind of then try and think about how someone's speech and language fits in with their emotional regulation, or how it fits in with their sensory needs and all of those kind of things, and how they fit together. A big thing that we are kind of, that is pushed in our training as well, is evidence-based practice. So we try to keep in touch with a lot of the research around different interventions and things that we might be suggesting, so that we know that some of the interventions or the strategies are based in kind of evidence and research, and that there's been that kind of research into it, so we're not just kind of guessing what would be the best thing for the young person. We also have quite a kind of big ethical code to our work, and so we want to be thinking about how we can be the most ethical in our practice, and some of that is around working within the limits of our own competence is one of those ethical codes, so kind of making sure that we are always kind of seeking to develop our knowledge, so that we are providing knowledge that is kind of sound and based in that evidence, and not kind of and then if there is a time where we don't know the answer to something, going off and doing that additional research before we give an answer. And overall, that all kind of fits together into that application of psychological theory. And all that means is just that we are trained in psychology, and that we're kind of trying to apply that when we're thinking about what might be going on for a young person in their education. So in terms of our work, it kind of splits into two. And that's statutory work, which just means that it's funded by the council, the local authority, and then non-statutory work, which is work that we do in schools that is not funded by the council. So the statutory work covers our assessments that we do to help the education, health and care plan assessment process. And it also includes sometimes as coming along to an annual review if a child does have an EHCP, and kind of monitoring how they're doing after we've done that initial assessment. And it also kind of covers that general providing of advice and support to professionals within the council in different roles on meeting young people's needs. And then in Southampton, it's the thing about the educational psychologist is that the role is very, very different depending on which council you work for. So there are some things that are Southampton specific, and that is that every school has a link educational psychologist. They can then choose how much they buy into the service, but they do have that link educational psychologist role. And another thing that is funded by the council is critical incident support, which is basically if a school were to have a kind of big tragic event happen, if there were to be a death in a school, if there were in one of the pupils or one of the staff, that kind of thing, if there was kind of a big incident in school, we would be the people who would go in and kind of provide the psychological support across the school. So those are the kind of things that are funded by the council. But the main thing when we're thinking about this statutory work is just us contributing to the assessment that would lead, hope to an EHCP. Then the opposite side of that is our traded work. So educational psychology services are now kind of traded services, which feels a bit strange, but what that means is that each school will have their link EP, and the school can then choose how much time that they buy in from the EP service. So it does really, really vary, is a kind of strange thing about our job. So there'll be some schools who buy in a huge amount of EP time, and that's something that they choose to use their budget for, whereas there'll be other schools who buy in very small amounts of EP time. So it does really vary, and I've got kind of a few different link schools, and some of them I see a lot of the time, most weeks. Other schools I see much more infrequently. But this kind of traded work is kind of the fun work, so it's quite tailored to the setting. They can kind of request things, and we can see whether it's something we can provide. It can be more kind of short-term work or long-term work. And sometimes it's kind of providing things that are citywide initiatives, so things like the Autism in Schools project, or we train autism champions within schools, or it can be just kind of very specific to one individual child. So it can be that kind of citywide bigger projects, or it can be more kind of individualized. So in terms of what it actually looks like, because that's all kind of the background to it, in schools, the work that we can do can really, really vary. So these are just some of the things that schools may ask us to do. So the first one on here is casework. And that generally is if they have one particular student where they want to do a bit more exploration around what their kind of areas of strength and need are, and where the school should be focusing in terms of their targets and the interventions that they're putting in, the strategies that they're using. It could be casework specifically because they're worried about a young person's behaviour. Sometimes it could be casework where the main focus is around their cognition and learning, but that will be very much about one individual child. Sometimes we then also do consultation, so I'm just jumping 2 across, but consultation is almost like a shorter version of casework, where we would just be working mainly with the adults. So in a consultation, it will be around talking to the adults, whereas the casework might be a bit longer because we may spend some time working with the young person. Those are kind of the 2 things that often people assume are the main things that we do. And in some schools, we just do consultations and casework if that's the thing that they would like us to do. But in other schools, we do, casework's on there twice, isn't it? Interesting. In some schools, statutory work. I have the box of all you guys over it. So I just saw the end and thought it was casework. No. So statutory work, so the EHCPs, which I've kind of already explained. Then we've got casework and consultation. But schools sometimes also want us to work with their teachers. So doing things like supervision, which is or coaching, if there are teachers who have a specific area of their practice that they want us to help them with. Sometimes it can be kind of just providing support for teachers if they're having a particularly stressful time, those kind of supervision type things. There might be kind of policy development things that they ask us to do. So helping the school to kind of change the way that they approach behaviour as a general thing might be an example of that type of work. We do a lot of kind of training. So I think I've got another slide a bit later on with some of the training offers that we offer in schools, or we can actually, I love it when a school asks me to do this, but it's a bit more unusual, but we can actually kind of do the actual intervention if we're saying that it would be helpful for the school to have a particular intervention in place. Sometimes we do get to do that, which is the best, because I do miss being in school. And then finally, the last one is sometimes EPs are seconded to or have specialisms within other services. So there are some EPs within our service who work for the virtual school and have a specialism in supporting young people in care or looked after young people. There's an EP who works with the kind of mental health in schools practitioners. So some people have that kind of specialism within their role. But I think the main way that a parent would kind of encounter our work would tend to be around this kind of consultation or casework type approach. So the next thing I wanted to do was kind of go into a bit more depth about what that would actually look like. So in terms of things we might explore, it could be that school would like our input around specific literacy or maths difficulties. It could be that a student is generally kind of not making academic progress, and they would like us to kind of try and work out what it is that might be a barrier to them making progress. It could be around their communication and language in school. It can be about motor coordination, can be around kind of confidence, motivation, self-esteem. We see quite a lot, particularly since COVID, of emotionally based school absence. So young people who, for some kind of social or emotional reason, are finding it very difficult to be in school. Sometimes we'll help kind of do some analysis of the young person's behaviour and think about what might be maintaining that behaviour, or what might be a way of supporting them to change that behaviour to something that's more functional for them. Sometimes it's around memory and processing, attention, emotional regulation, sometimes social skills. So it is kind of a really broad remit. And although some of these, like communication and language, could be something that you would assume a speech and language therapist would be the person who would take on, actually sometimes if a young person doesn't have access to that service and school wants some of that kind of first advice, we might be the person to do that. Or it might be that they want to know how that communication and language is then linked to someone's confidence. So it could be that there's a young person whose communication is affecting their general self-esteem, so they want to have the EP input to kind of understand all those connections. So when we start a piece of casework, we kind of go through these 6 phases, but I've tried to kind of color code them and then put along the side what that actually looks like, because it sounds kind of more complicated maybe than it is. So the first phase we always want to do is gather background information, and so that usually looks like an information gathering meeting with parents and school staff. So that's kind of the main way that you would see us in one of those kind of information gathering meetings. And this would be the same whether it was an EHCP assessment that we were doing, or if it was a piece of casework or consultation that we were doing. So we know that parents are the kind of ultimate experts in their own children, and that's the best way that we can get information. I think sometimes people really worry because when we go into school and observe a young person, sometimes they suddenly do something that they've never done before, or they're having an amazing day, or they're having a day where us being there is kind of quite stressful for them and we're a new person and unfamiliar. So then they present very differently. And I think people always worry that we'll go only off of what we see on that day. But there's been cases where, for instance, I went to a preschool and saw a young person who suddenly started running around with the other children who'd never ever interacted with other children before. And we know that parents and school staff or preschool staff are the kind of experts, and we can't just go off of our what we see on that one day. So this is kind of, if anything, I think probably the most important part of what we do. In those meetings with me particularly, it would be, and I think probably with any EP, it would be just kind of introductions, and then lots of questions, unfortunately, where we kind of try to get to know the young person as much as we can through the people who know them the best and spend the most time with them. So I tend to go through lots of questions about kind of how they are at home, what their behavior is like, what their communication is like at home, who the people are who are the most important to them, whether they're kind of slightly different at home or in school. Quite often children present super differently at home and in school, so that's why it's really, really important to speak to both parents and staff from the setting that they are in. So sometimes this meeting will take place all together, so with parents and school staff there, and then you can hear both sides. So each time you ask a question, you can kind of say, what's that like in school and what's that like at home? Other times it's quite tricky to get everyone in the same place at the same time, or parents work or those kind of things. So in that instance, we can do those separately. So speak to parents separately to school. I think with any EP, if parents did want that chance to speak separately because they felt that they could be more open without representatives of the school or the preschool or college or whatever it is there, that would be absolutely fine, because we want everyone to be able to kind of give as much information as they're happy to give. So sometimes that is separate, sometimes it's all together, but other times parents really want that extra bit of time with school to hear what their responses are to all of these questions, because children present so differently in those two contexts. Other times they're just completely the same in both places, and it's just like everyone just says the same thing, but it is still really important to kind of hear both sides, because there's different levels of familiarity in those two contexts, and school is such a kind of different context to home, because you have so much more sensory demands, so much more kind of social demand with all of you rarely kind of spend time with that many people as an adult, and all the kind of academic and task demands that maybe wouldn't be there at home. So that's the first step. So just sort of information gathering. If it were a consultation, it might be that then that information gathering is the first half of the meeting, And then we kind of jump past this phase 2 and 3 and go straight to the kind of action planning and target setting part of things, just based off of the conversation that we've had. But if it were a more extended piece of casework, we would have time to do the kind of phase 2, phase 3 on this step, which is working with the child. And it says initial hypothesis testing, which sounds kind of, again, more complicated than it is. What that would be is, from that conversation that we've had with parents and school staff, we would kind of start to think, what do we think might be a key area for this child? And then do some activities with them where they have a chance to kind of show their strengths, but also show if there are some areas that they are finding more difficult. And that helps us to kind of identify these key areas. So sometimes we can kind of identify those key areas in that conversation with parents. Other times it might be that we need to do a few more activities with the child. So if we suspect that it could be that they have some differences in their working memory, we might then kind of do some tasks with them, find out whether that is the case through those activities that we're doing. That then tends to lead to kind of feedback about what we think those key areas are. So we're looking at the whole big picture and thinking, what is the thing that if we work on, it's going to make the most difference? So is it that this young person is finding it really hard to make progress at school because they are really, really struggling with sustaining their attention on something? And actually, if we focused on a target around their attention, that would open up lots and lots of other learning opportunities. If they could sustain their attention for a little bit longer. So we'll feedback what it is we think that kind of main point of intervention is. So what we think that key area is that will make the most difference. And then start to do some planning about what kind of strategies or interventions. It says interventions, but all that means is kind of putting something into place. And so that could be just changing the way we speak to a young person. It could be providing them with visuals. It could be kind of an actual kind of intervention, like a structured formal thing. So any intervention just means kind of anything we would put in place to change things for the child. So we like to do that kind of action planning as much as collaboratively as possible, because it's really tricky as the EP when we don't really know the young person. We've only met them maybe once or twice, and we can suggest things, but actually parents or school might just say, oh, that they'd hate that, or then they wouldn't be interested in that wouldn't work for them. So we like for the kind of action planning bit to be as collaborative as possible. And quite often, if we've kind of come to that agreement about what the key areas are that are barriers for that young person, other people can then start to think, oh, okay, if it is their attention that we need to work on, I know what really captures their attention, so we could do this and that. So actually, it's really nice at that point if everyone can kind of get involved with ideas and strategies based on that kind of formulation. So that kind of picture that the EP is given about what might be the thing that the area that we could be working on most effectively. And then phase 6, it says monitoring and evaluation. So like I said before, we always try, if we're doing a piece of casework, to do a review meeting with parents and school, so that then in the future we come back and see whether any of the strategies or things we've suggested have worked, or whether it's that we need to change the target if it was too difficult, or change it if it was too easy, if they've made loads of progress. So it really varies. But it's just so that then school aren't left with that one kind of initial suggestion without then an opportunity to modify that later down the line. And with both a consultation and casework, all of that will then be put into a report that's sent to parents and to school. And in that report, hopefully you'd then get a description of kind of the whole picture, and then it would focus down into kind of these are the bits that we want to work on at the moment. So like I said, we kind of, if we are going to do some work with the child, it says we kind of use these assessment tools, which can sound like it would be like a test or something that's kind of quite scary or not going to be very pleasant for the young person, but we always try to kind of make it as friendly and accessible as possible. So some services do like to use kind of standardized assessments, which are those more formal assessments, which might come out with like a age equivalent. So they might say, oh, this child is working at an age of kind of like 7 years and 9 months or something like that. And they tend to then give quite a concrete answer about what someone is struggling with. There's also, on the flip side of that, dynamic assessment, which we as a service kind of tend to lean towards because it's focused around us working out what support works for the young person. So rather than kind of listing off the things that they're finding, rather than doing an assessment that will give us an answer about what they're finding hard, we are kind of doing more of a assessment where we're playing games or doing activities, and then we're testing out different ways of supporting that young person. So if they then start to find something hard, we can make a note of that, but then we're jumping in with kind of some kind of support or some kind of way of working with the young person and testing out what support is most likely to be helpful to them. So with dynamic assessment, you kind of do get that picture of what it is that they are finding difficult, but then also what the adult could be doing to make things better for them. So in our reports, then we would be wanting to capture what it is that are their strengths and areas of need, but also kind of thinking more holistically around what the adult could be doing to help. So that's the kind of difference between those two. And sometimes there are times where we need a standardized assessment because we need to know kind of exactly where that young person is at. But other times it might be that everybody is kind of quite aware of the things that they struggle with, and the thing that is going to be the most useful for us to do an assessment about is what we could be doing to help them. So those are the kind of two differences with the types of assessment tools that EPs use. EPs are kind of, we all kind of make our own decisions around which ones we use, but as a service, kind of Southampton tends to lean a little bit more towards that kind of more dynamic assessment where you are then getting that kind of picture of what the adults could be doing. We also try to use, if we can, we always try and use person-centered planning tools where we are spending time talking to the young person about what actually is important to them and what it is that they want to be working on. Because we don't want to kind of come in and set targets which are not a priority for that young person. So for instance, kind of I think social skills are a tricky one where sometimes it might be assumed that social skills is a good target for a young person, but actually if they're quite happy being more solitary in their play outside, if they actually that's not an area of priority for them, this is why we might, as part of our assessment, try to work out and find out what they want to achieve and what it is that they want to focus their things on, so that it's a balance of what the adults around them think is going to be helpful to them, but also taking the young person's views into account. We also kind of use, so as I said before, observation is another kind of way of assessing. So just seeing how they function in class and then outside, and then also the information gathering with the key adults. So we've kind of jumped back a little bit here, but it just was to emphasize again that when we say assessment tools, if part of the consent form about an EP becoming involved with your child said that we were going to do some assessment work with a young person, generally what that would look like is us coming in, spending some time kind of building rapport with that young person, doing some games and things to try and make ourselves less of a stranger and kind of less unfamiliar. I always kind of take in a little profile about myself where I share some information about the things that are important to me, things I'd like to get better at, and then we can ask them similar questions back. And then it would be that we'd do some of those activities if they're comfortable to kind of get that wider picture about their strengths, needs, and what adults can do to kind of support them best. So it sounds kind of more formal maybe than it is. And the other thing, as part of our kind of ethical practice that we always say, is that the young person, if they don't want to work with us, they don't have to. If they were finding an assessment or something that we were doing kind of stressful, they can always say that they don't want to do it, and we wouldn't sort of pressure the young person to continue with that assessment. We'd kind of find another way around it. So sometimes if there was a really anxious young person and we wanted to collect their views, we may then give some of our tools to a teacher or to a parent so that they can then collect those views and send them to us, so that we'd find another way around it if they were worried or anxious around working with us. So now, just as a kind of, just to put on there some of the training things that we offer for schools, now that I've kind of gone through that casework process, schools can ask for training on kind of whatever it is that they want, but as you can see on this slide, they may choose to kind of ask for some training that could be specifically around well-being and kind of social emotional skills. So it could be around kind of mindfulness or resilience or emotional literacy. Schools can ask for training around that's more academic based, so precision teaching, which is like a specific way of teaching if some to support the young person with a specific target. They might ask for something that's more of like a whole school thing around kind of feedback and how they provide feedback to a child. So across this PowerPoint, I'm hoping it kind of shows that although casework is the main way that you might come across the EP service, it could be that the school are using their EP time for some of those kind of wider things like these training offers. So in terms of accessing EP support, it is quite different in the sense that services like CAMS may have like this way of referring a child, where then there's a kind of waiting list, and then but all children in theory will be seen eventually, but it might just be that there's kind of a long wait time. But with EP support, we don't have that kind of central referral service, so that is the kind of main difference in the way that it can be a bit tricky, because the referrals and the kind of requests for our involvement have to come through our link schools for the kind of casework and consultation support. However, in terms of accessing an EP for an EHCP assessment, that's then a bit different, because parents and schools can both put in kind of requests for an EHCP assessment. So there are professionals within the council who can, if they feel like they want to kind of enhance their CPD or their professional development, they can book in telephone consultations with the EP service. But the main way that a young person would be put in touch with an educational psychologist would be through their school. So like I said before, all schools have a link educational psychologist, and they then choose how they kind of allocate that time. So it is a bit trickier in the sense that I can't say that it is like a service like CAMS where parents could kind of refer. It would come through the school, and like I said before, all schools have very different amounts of time. So sorry, I've got a cough. So it can really vary as to how much time they're able to kind of allocate to individuals. However, sometimes, like I said, schools are using, if for instance they had a lot of young people within their school who they felt were presenting as being quite anxious, they may then be using their EP time to do that kind of whole school training about managing anxiety, or they may be using their EP time for staff support around how they support those young people. So sometimes there may be more EP things going on than are kind of obvious from a parent perspective. Other times it might be that schools ask us to do work with parents and then it's really obvious. So that just makes it a bit different to other services. Now, kind of the last thing I wanted to say firstly was that we do have some specialist educational psychologists. So there may be slightly different ways of kind of coming across an educational psychologist if it was one of these specialists. So we've got Alex Boys, who is one of our kind of senior EPs, and she, all of the acronyms come after her name, but she has a secondment with the virtual school. So she works quite specifically on some days of the week with young people who are in care or who are under child protection plans or children in need plans. Joy is also joint specialist, so with the same kind of title after that. So sometimes if there were a young person who fell under the remit of the virtual school, they might have this kind of specific input from a specialist EP. There's Ed Sayer, who is a specialist EP for mental health and wellbeing. So again, he will work with the mental health in schools practitioners, and kind of some of that wider sometimes is working in conjunction with services like CAMS. And then we also have an EP, called Karen, who is a post-16 specialist EP, because the kind of work that we do with post-16-year-olds is more rare, because quite often by that point they've had quite a lot of support going through their education, but sometimes there are colleges and unis and things like that who want specific support for things like exam access arrangements, or for supporting a young person with kind of choosing their options and preparing for adulthood, those types of things. It could be that it's in a specialist setting who have post-16-year-olds and we're thinking about transition. So there are times when it comes up, and Karen is the kind of specialist educational psychologist in that area. So that was where I was going to stop. I do have some more information about kind of EHCPs, if that was something that would be helpful, but I kind of thought that was where I would stop with kind of the role of the EP. So now I thought if anyone had questions, or if I do need to go back to the kind of stuff I had about EHCPs, then I can come back to it if that comes up.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. I think, should we see if there are, I've got a whole list of questions, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, you're fine.
But I'll see if anyone else. Lisa, do you have any questions? Or I should say, if you do,
I do actually, if that's all right. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
That was really good. I've learned lots actually. I just wondered, maybe your thoughts, or kind of what kind of things might work in place. Kind of what role EP maybe has for children who maybe present well at school, but then don't present as well outside of school. So you kind of touched on it, I think, a little bit in the middle. So for example, I have a young person who at school presents very well, is engaged in class, does their work, meets all the requirements for school. But you probably get this a lot, that once out of school, that's a whole different ball game. And I just wondered maybe where the role of the EP sits with that, or what is that something that you guys get involved with, when maybe school is okay but other things aren't, or?
Yeah, definitely. So like you said, sometimes it goes both ways. So sometimes we see young people who really struggle in school, but then are very, very different at home. And other times we see young people who kind of manage to get through the day really well at school, or present as if they're getting through the day really well in school. And then parents see a very different side of things when they get home, and they've kind of been holding that in all day. That is something that we do see quite a lot, which is why we always try to kind of have that balance of parent input and also school input. Again, it would have to be a school that would refer a young person, but that does happen if school and parents have that kind of really good relationship, where then they are communicating about the kind of difficulties that someone's seeing with their child at home, and then school have that kind of wider concern about their general kind of development. We also kind of do some training sometimes around things like masking, or helping school staff to understand that whole thing of kind of a young person who presents very differently in one context to another context, and how that can come about through the kind of autism champions thing that we do, where we do training for particular members of staff in school. That's something that we've kind of touched on quite a bit, and how increasing kind of school staff understanding of that can then prevent people from making those assumptions that actually just because it seems like everything's okay in school doesn't mean that then that is the case when you look at the wider picture. So in that instance, it then can be really useful to do those parent and school meetings together, so that then school are getting that whole picture rather than just seeing those hours where it seems as though the child is kind of getting on with their work and doing everything exactly like you said. So it is something that comes up quite a bit, particularly sometimes in kind of EHCP assessments as well. We will try and kind of really reflect both sides of things, and that the impact of them kind of getting through the day, which then may then affect how they're able to kind of function after the school day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you. Yeah, no, brilliant.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, I'm going to go through some of mine.
Yeah, no worries.
So these were some of the questions that some parents had asked
Mhm.
that couldn't make it today. I think you've already covered the one about the fact that parents can't make their own referral to an EP service. It has to come through a school, which is something we've been asked a few times. Another question was that CAMS feel there as a learning need. So they want it checked by the EP service, but school are not very keen to do that. Is there any way around that?
Yeah, so this is a really, really tricky one, and it does happen sometimes that other services will say that a child needs to be seen by an EP without kind of that understanding that parents aren't able to make that referral, and that it is very dependent on whether school have the kind of capacity to make that referral themselves. So that is a really, really tricky scenario that is quite kind of frustrating for us as well, because we then know that parents are kind of really want for that. They've had that advice, they know that then it might be that the EP would be the person who would that CAMS are suggesting would be helpful to see, and then they can't kind of access them. So it is a really tricky thing. The one thing I would say is that we as EPs are not allowed to make diagnoses. So I think historically, a long time ago, EPs would be the people who would make that kind of diagnosis. And so sometimes people assume that if an EP becomes involved, that is something that we would be able to do, but we are not able to do that now. So our reports and our work is all around kind of what could be put in place to make things kind of better for that young person, and what targets and areas that it's kind of presenting that profile of strengths and needs, but without a kind of specific label attached to that. So if a parent was hoping to kind of look into kind of a specific diagnoses around a young person's learning needs, or had kind of specific concerns, then were thinking about that kind of diagnosis or label, we would then direct them to the kind of GP pediatrician. So sometimes that can be kind of another route if you're looking at kind of diagnoses, but I do agree it is a really, really tricky thing when other services kind of direct to EPs without knowing that kind of difficulty.
That's really helpful, actually, and it's interesting to know that you can go to your GP. You know, we get a lot of families sort of asking about dyslexia or dyscalculia assessment, or even, you know, how if they think their child's got a learning disability. So it would be your GP then potentially that you could go to ask for more support in that area.
Yeah, and quite often, even recently, it seems to be that I've had lots of young people where there's been kind of a general concern about their development across the board. So not in one specific area, where maybe they didn't then know where to go because they weren't presenting in a way that was consistent with maybe like autism or ADHD. So they weren't then sure whether because it wasn't CAMS and we couldn't make that diagnosis, and they didn't really know. So that it's come up quite a few times recently where then it is the GP that would kind of be the next step. So
okay,
that's another option.
Yeah, no, that's really useful to know. You talked about the fact that sometimes when you meet a young person for the first time, you take a bit of information about yourself and just so they know. Is that something that could be sent out to parents in advance of the meeting, or does that happen so that young people at least know a face and a little bit about who they're going to meet?
So definitely I mean, I would assume that everyone does this, but we all kind of work quite individually. But I know everyone has kind of little one-page profiles about themselves. Mine's got like a photo of me on there, and just like I think the boxes are who am I, kind of like what is an educational psychologist type thing, in kind of child-friendly language. What will we do? So it says kind of we might do some kind of drawing or some games or it has a kind of list of some of the things that we might do, and then it's got a picture of me and things that are important to me, things that I want to get better at. Those are the kind of main things that I use as a starting point. And sometimes then my first activity will be, I have a blank one of those that then I'll fill in for the young person that is kind of mirrored. So yeah, that is something that I will definitely send out in advance if that's likely to be settling to a young person. And I always think it's a bit odd if you just kind of turn up in the classroom. So we always ask for schools to kind of prepare a young person, and if we've sent that, to print it and kind of give it to them beforehand so they know that we're going to arrive.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's really good. The thing is, we quite often get asked by parents, what can they do to prepare for a meeting with you? Is there any sort of top tips about what a parent could, or carer could do in advance of a meeting?
Yeah, so I don't know whether sort of the main thing would just to be to think about. So there's some questions that I always ask that I think are really tricky for parents on the spot. So maybe these are things that you could think about before. So one of them is I always ask them first to describe their child. And for that sounds like an easy question, but actually on the spot, it's really hard, because I like to start my reports with kind of like some words to describe the young person so that you get that sense of who they are before you're then going into the kind of, this is what they're finding difficult. So yeah, that's always something where I ask it thinking, that's a good way to start things off, when actually it can be a bit tricky. So just kind of thinking about a general description that you would have of your young person. Then I tend to go for more specific questions. So then I'm not sure necessarily you could prepare, but I'd ask about kind of, how does it look when they're really happy? What does it look like if they're less happy? What kinds of things would help them feel calm? Those kinds of things. So they're more specific. So I'm not sure you could necessarily prepare for those, but it's just thinking about, I tend to go through those 4 areas that you would see in an EHCP. So thinking about their communication, thinking about their learning, thinking about their kind of social, emotional, mental health, and then thinking about their physical kind of self-care, sensory needs. So you could kind of think through those things. And then the last question that again is kind of that sometimes stumps people is about your kind of main aspirations for your child. So I will usually, when I'm thinking about target setting, again, it's really important that we've got parent and pupil views as much as we can around kind of what their aspirations are. So yeah, main concerns and aspirations sometimes can be really tricky to condense it down into one of those things. So that might be something to think about. But I think generally, although it might feel like it's something you'd need to prepare for, it is more just kind of like a chat. And sometimes parents come and they've got things that they really want to tell us about. So they have then kind of a big, like sometimes people write notes and then we say like, okay, you go with those first before I start asking loads of questions, because then you've said everything that you wanted to say. Other times it is more just like a chat and it's just me asking lots of questions and typing things, but it's just kind of generally thinking about their strengths as well as another one, because we always try to think about what strengths that they do have that we can then use to support them to develop the other areas that they're finding more difficult. So that's another one to think about. But just kind of, if you did want to make notes, sometimes that can be really useful just to have things written down. But I always try to give people my email address after a meeting like that, because sometimes people go away and think, oh, I forgot to say about their sleep or like something like that, and then they can just send it afterwards. So
yeah, that's brilliant. That's really helpful. And yeah, you're right, there's always something you've forgotten in a meeting that you suddenly panic about. So no, that's really helpful. And I guess it's just sort of worth maybe highlighting with parents and carers about schools, unless they're buying in and have the funds to buy in extra, actually the number of days they get in a year from an EP are quite limited. So it's up to the schools to kind of prioritize how they use that time.
Yeah, and that is really tricky. But like I said, it can be that it appears as though they don't have a lot of time for casework, but then they're doing something, like if they're seeing a broader pattern of lots of young people who are finding it difficult to be in school and are quite anxious, then it might be that they've thought, rather than kind of seeing each young person one by one, which might take a longer period of time if they don't have many days per year, they may then have kind of prioritized that as an area of staff development. And so we may be in but doing something that's not just casework, or so sometimes it can look slightly different. But yeah, I think that is something that's quite tricky about kind of the EP service, is the fact that it does have to come from schools and in that kind of traded way, unless it is the EHCP assessment route. But yeah.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, I feel like I've interviewed you.
No, you're fine.
Christy on lots of things. Let me just check if there's any other questions. Silence. So I'm guessing not. We've only got 5 minutes. So I don't know if you can cram EHCPs into 5 minutes, or we'll leave it for today.
I don't mind, whatever you would prefer. It's just a couple of slides about the process, just if anyone was gonna.
Yeah, I'm sure that would be really helpful. Yes, please.
Yeah, okay, I'll go back to screen share again.
Okay.
Yeah, so just the last thing, because we are kind of involved in EHCPs, and most of what I spoke about was more so around kind of casework or traded work that a school may buy in. This is kind of what our involvement would look like in an EHCP assessment. So in kind of beforehand, it was they were statements of special educational needs, but now are referred to as kind of education, health and care plans. Anyone between the age of 0 and 25 can apply, which is partially why we're kind of involved across that big age range. But those who are over 16 need to still be in educational training to apply for one. So EHC assessments and then the plans that possibly would be drawn up afterwards are kind of under that Children and Families Act, which is part of why they're then provided as a service by the council rather than schools having to buy in that time. So that's another thing just to emphasize, is that schools, even if they didn't have very much EP time, there's no limitation around the amount of EHCP assessments that they can request for children in their school. The EHC assessment is basically, from our perspective, around gathering information, like I've already said, describing the child or young person, kind of giving as much of a picture as we can at that time around their needs, what outcomes we want for them, so that's kind of targets, and what support they will need to achieve those outcomes, and then who it is that would be best at providing that support. So in terms of eligibility, all of those EHC assessments are considered at a kind of panel meeting, so multi-agency panel meeting where there's representatives from education, health and social care. So if a request for an assessment was taken to that panel, they'd be thinking about the kind of following questions. So do they have a significant barrier to their learning in comparison with other children their age or young people their age? Has the setting, so the school or preschool, already sought advice from external professionals? So sometimes when an application comes in for an assessment, it will include all of that kind of evidence that that child has seen an EP or a speech and language therapist, those types of things. Have they responded to that advice and tried to kind of set SMART targets and reviewed what they're doing, and kind of have they tried those strategies that have been suggested by those professionals and reviewed their progress over time? And have they kind of given clear information around how the SEN budget has been used to support the child or young person? So we do get parent requests that go through that don't necessarily have that final bit of information, but often it can be really helpful if it does have content from the parent and from the school that then helps to give that picture of what advice have they sought, what things have they put into place, and what has that helped or not helped. And then just in terms of what it looks like, so it would start off with an application coming in. That would then go to a panel within 6 weeks. So there are these quite sort of strict timescales around EHCPs. So we're quite lucky in Southampton that we are sticking to those timescales, because there are other councils that are not, but because of the volume of kind of requests. But so the application would go in, there'd be a decision within 6 weeks around whether that child or young person is going to have a needs assessment. Then that needs assessment would be allocated to different professionals. So it would be professionals who are already involved with that child. So if they had a speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist, but an EP is always then kind of allocated the needs assessment. So we get weekly kind of email that goes around with all of the allocations that have been made, all of the needs assessments that have been agreed, and then who's going to do each one. Then we get 6 weeks, so again quite a strict timescale, to do all of our information gathering. So that would be the meeting with parents, the meeting with school, and any assessment work that we do with the young person. So all of that has to be done within the 6 weeks, and then we write that up into our report. There's usually then quite a long report, which is the EP report, and then there's a summary document, which would be someone who kind of takes control of the whole case and makes a summary of everything that's come from all of the different professionals that have been asked for their reports. So then you get the kind of summary which has social care and speech and language and the EP report, and they kind of put it all together. Parents then at that opportunity get invited to a meeting where, at that point, even get invited to a meeting where they can say whether they're happy with that summary document, whether they feel that the child has been represented accurately and fairly, and that all of the things that they wanted to be kind of included have been included. And then that would then go to the panel for them to decide whether, with all that information in that summary document, that young person needs an EHCP, or whether they don't, or whether they're given a non-statutory plan, which is kind of a similar plan, but it's not kind of, doesn't have the legal kind of weight behind it that an EHCP does. And then the decision is made from that panel, and a draft, if an EHCP has been granted, is given back to parents to check through and make sure that they're happy with it. And then that would then be finalised into an education, health and care plan. So in terms of our involvement, it's this kind of middle box on this arrow where the needs assessment has been agreed, we've been allocated that particular needs assessment, and we're coming into schools or preschools or colleges, speaking to parents, speaking to school, and spending some time with the young person to then write our report, which goes as part of the kind of draft that then is given back to the panel. So it's just worth saying there as well that the EP, if you were to meet them at that point, isn't able to kind of make that decision. It's their kind of general report that has their opinion about their strengths and needs that then will be used by the panel. So that's just another thing to say, is that we don't necessarily make that decision, we just contribute our opinion as one of the professionals who's been asked to contribute.
That's amazing. That's
so
really
that's
helpful.
my go at doing it in 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, that was really, really good. It's been a fantastic session. I've learned a lot, actually. It's been really useful. And I think as families come across EPs and, you know, are told that they're going to have a meeting with them, this will be a really useful resource. So I'm going to stop recording.